What I would like to talk about now is really the question of how do we deal with the adversities that are, bound to happen in our life. As human beings, individually, each of one is, bound to confront with difficult situations. The story of how to deal with suffering is not a new one. In fact, one of the first teachings by the Buddha was actually on the nature of suffering and how to deal with it. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is really, someone like ourselves who have grown up in contemporary culture, we have a problem with suffering. And in fact, I'm a parent of two young daughters, and parents of my generation, and I noticed particularly that many of us have problem when we see our children suffer, and somehow, compared to people from older generation, I noticed that those of our generation and younger really have difficulty, tolerating pain in our children, particularly in our children. We become, as parents, very protective. But on the other hand, as the Buddha reminded us, one of the unavoidable aspects of human condition is the situation of suffering. And so a large part of our kind of strategy or approach for dealing with the question of happiness really would depend very much on to what extent we're able to deal with life's inevitable, situations of pain and suffering. So I often tell my colleagues and friends that contemporary people, particularly those who have grown up in the West, in the consumerist culture, we have kind of subconsciously imbued in ourselves the notion that, we can get rid of all the suffering. We can create a kind of a cocoon where we can be completely buffered against any kind of pain. And in fact, to experience pain and suffering is almost like a kind of a failure. That somehow, if we are suffering, this is because we haven't got something right. And here I think to have a kind of a much more realistic and kind of a constructive attitude to suffering and adversities of life is going to be key to our happiness. And I personally believe that the key to happiness does not lie in being able to avoid all pain and suffering, which in any case is impossible to achieve anyway. But the key lies more in being able to tolerate suffering and pain and ensure that our experience of suffering and pain does not undermine our basic equilibrium and composure. That really is the challenge. Then the question is, how do we deal with, our adversities, disappointments in life, breakup of relationships, a loss of loved one, and, issues dealing with our disappointment in children and our perceived lack of respect on the part of the children to ourselves as parents. So there are, of course, many, and then, loss of job, unemployment, financial challenges and so on. So these are part and parcel of, growing up as human beings. So then the question is, how do we deal with them? One of the points that I find really helpful that is emphasized in the Buddhist teachings when dealing with adversity and problem is the need to see your own situation in terms of universal experience of human condition. Because one of the things, when we are confronted with the situation of problem and adversity, what makes a particular experience acutely painful is the sense of loneliness, that you feel alone. And when sense of loneliness and feeling alone is accompanied by your experience of adversity, that is very unbearable. And here I think particularly contemporary people from contemporary culture needs to watch out, because quite often, because we have a kind of a culturally a difficult perspective on the whole situation of pain and suffering in any case. Because of this, there's a tendency to look at your situation or problem as being unfair on you. And people even ask, why me? And this is unfair. And when you respond to situations of pain and suffering in those terms, basically what you're doing is you're isolating yourself from other humans. And you tend to look at your situation in a very solitary, isolated kind of ego terms. And that can really exacerbate your response to suffering. And here I think this, reminding yourself the universality of the experience of suffering can really take out this kind of the sting, which often accompanies the experience of pain, which is this feeling of being alone. And if you are able to look at your situation in the context of shared common human experience, then at least even though the experience that you're undergoing is painful and a difficult one, but you wouldn't feel isolated and alienated from others. And that sense of connection can also be a basis for you to then seek out help. Because when you look at suffering and situation of suffering in terms of ego and solitary ego, then your tendency would be to, why me? It's unfair. And which then leads on to a reluctance on your part to seek out help. Because when we are going through a very difficult time, one of the most effective way of dealing with suffering is to seek out help from others. And that very act of seeking help from others will allow you to open your heart and connect with others and make yourself benefit from the social support that your loved ones will provide. One of the central teachings of the Buddha, which I find very, very insightful, is that it is often our resistance to suffering and pain that exacerbates the situation. Suffering and pain, an experience of that is part of our human condition. But what exacerbates that situation is our resistance to suffering, our inability to tolerate and accept it. So now then the question is, how do we train ourselves so that we do not feel that somehow we have to control everything, that we do not resist suffering. We have a kind of a more enlightened attitude and response to a situation of suffering. And here, one of the things is that it is, again, one key factor is our mindset, our attitude towards suffering and pain. There is a beautiful teaching by an 8th century Buddhist master by the name of Shantideva. It's in an important text where he talks about suffering, having explained the fact that one of the fundamental drives of not just human beings but all sentient beings is the instinctive wish to avoid suffering, the instinctive kind of response to shun anything that is painful. So, of course, suffering and pain is something that we all find aversive. That's a very natural response. He goes on to explain this, but then he goes on to say that actually there are also virtues to suffering and pain. And by this, I'm not advocating that we should deliberately seek suffering and pain, because suffering and pain are going to be part of our experience anyway. We don't have to seek them out. But once the situation of pain and suffering has already occurred, then adopting a more enlightened response and attitude really makes a big difference. And some of the virtues he listed are really, quite powerful. For example, he says that when we experience adversity and situation of pain and suffering, he says that it brings us greater humility. So in some sense, it reminds us of our basic humanity. And here, I remember once the Dalai Lama wrote in one of his books that he said that one of the great benefits he has experienced as a refugee, once he became stateless and having had to leave his country and everything behind, he said that that experience of exile, that experience of displacement brought him much closer to reality. I think he has a point. So Shantideva says that experience of suffering and adversity makes us humble, more humble. So humility becomes an important benefit. A second thing which he says is that because of our experience of pain and suffering, we will be in a better position to empathize with others who are undergoing similar situation. This, I think, is an very important insight, because there are now research that shows that people in position of power, those who are economically more affluent, they are found to have lesser empathy, lesser degree of empathy towards others. So that's one of the virtues of suffering and adversity, that somehow you're able to connect with the situation of others in a more empathetic way. And the third thing is that because of your own experience of suffering, there will be less tendency on your part to wanting to harm others, because you know that this is something that you don't like. Of course, having said that, sometimes people may react with a situation of a feeling of revenge and so on. I mean, we humans are very complicated, but generally speaking, because of our own experience of suffering, we are less inclined want to inflict that kind of experience on others. So those are really important virtues of suffering. Interestingly, now there is a lot of research that goes into what makes people resilient. There's a whole field of resilience science of resilience. Because for the scientist and psychologist, it's a puzzling question. Why do some people come out of a very difficult situation unscathed and even, in fact, stronger? And why do some people just break because of that experience? And same experience, some come out stronger and some, come out damaged and destroyed. So this is what scientists do. They're always asking questions, what makes the difference? So there's a whole field of study called the science of resilience. And there's a proverbial saying, what does not kill you makes you stronger. And there is a lot of truth in that statement. So there was an interesting, phrase that I came across, once reading about these kind of studies. And that phrase is post-traumatic growth. The post-traumatic growth refers to a situation where someone has experienced a traumatic experience in a situation, but comes out stronger. And I don't know, some of you might have actually, noticed this. There's an amazing story which I would probably refer to as the ultimate post-traumatic growth story. This is a story of a South African athlete who was a kind of a mediocre level Olympic athlete from South Africa. But one day, swimming in an ocean, he got attacked by a shark and he lost one of his legs, which of course was deeply, deeply traumatic experience. He had to go through surgery, amputation, and all the rest. When he came out of it, he retrained himself. Now he is a disabled athlete, and he was able to train so well that he ended up becoming a gold medalist swimmer in the Paralympics. After that, he became, one of the most passionate advocate of the, sharks' rights, protector of sharks. And then he explicitly says that he owes to the sharks that he has been successful, he's got a career, he's financially successful. So that's an ultimate example of what post-traumatic growth looks like. So so there are situations where we can use the experience of trauma as an opportunity to grow. And I think here, that's one of the important lessons that we have to remember, is that life is never going to be completely free of problem. And in any case, unless, even if you live alone as a hermit in the wilderness, even then you're going to have problem. And so life is never going to be free of problem. And furthermore, as human beings, we are gifted with a powerful brain and mental and cognitive capacity, which has a powerful memory that can look back into the past and dig out some kind of feeling of hurt that has been inflicted upon us. We are also able to project into the future, where we can have a lot of expectation and anticipations and so on. So this gift of this powerful brain with a cognitive capacity not only empowers us as one of the most successful creatures on earth, but at the same time it also offers the basis for creating a lot of problems which are creations of our own. So suffering and pain is never going to be absent in our life. If we are lucky, we will have less of those compared to others who are really going through a very difficult time. But we will have one or any form of suffering in our life anyway. So then, being able to adopt the right attitude, being able to have the right perspective, and being able to use the experience of suffering as an opportunity to grow, I think is going to be a powerful kind of ability on the part of the individual, each of us, so that instead of the experience of adversity weighing us down and beating us down, we could actually rise out of it stronger. And in fact, if you look at the powerful examples of impressive leaders of the past, like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and today the Dalai Lama, without their traumatic experience in early life, the challenges that they have experienced, the pain and suffering, you can't imagine. I can't imagine these leaders, of who they became. And it's the experience of adversity and their response to it that really shaped who they later became. And we are all the same. And each one of us has the ability to respond to a situation like that in a constructive manner. And here, of course, again, in the end, it's the mindset that we bring to the situation. It's also an awareness that we are able to bring to the situation, and then also awareness accompanied by an acceptance of the reality, so that our energy is not misspent on trying to control the situation and suppress it, but our energy will be spent more on responding to the situation and seeking solutions. In my own case, one of the most powerful advice that I really find helpful which is a very simple instruction. And by the way, it's an instruction that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, uses quite often when he's asked for an advice dealing with a problem. And this is, again, Shantideva, the 8th century Buddhist master that I referred to earlier. He suggests the following. He said, when you are confronted with a difficult situation or problem, he says that instead of getting emotionally worked up, you should analyze the situation, then ask yourself, can you do something about it? Can I do something about this? Is there a solution? And if the answer is yes, then he says there is no need to expend too much energy worrying about it and feeling overwhelmed, but use that energy to seek the solution and sort it out. On the other hand, if the answer is no, then he says, in any case, there is no point in expending all that energy worrying about it and being overwhelmed, because you're not going to be able to do anything anyway. Now, it's a rather radical, kind of harsh suggestion, but it is a powerful one. And I refer to this approach as, no need, no use principle in dealing with suffering and problem. And I personally find that approach actually quite helpful, when I'm, myself in a situation. And often many of the pains that we experience is a result of a situation where you alone yourself do not have the full control. A lot of our experience of suffering and pain, comes in the context of our interaction and relationship with, especially loved ones. And in those situations, your responsibility is not so much control the situation, but your responsibility is to make sure that your own participation in that, situation is a kind of at least an honest one, a kind of a transparent one, and then, take responsibility for the contribution you have made, but then leave it at that. And that way, I think, as yourself, as one of the participants in this, I think you will be much more liberated.